We are saving questions for the end of the program, so we're going to give Eric an opportunity to go ahead and give us remarks on behalf of Congressman Engel. I do know there are a couple of open seats, so if anybody from the audience is looking to sit down, please go ahead and grab your seat. And I'm also going to look to see if we can raise the temperature on this AC.
Thank you very much, Andres. I know that Congressman Engel really wanted to be here today, especially when he heard that he'd be sharing the stage with his good friend, Ambassador Gallegos. And in fact, as Congressman Engel often says to Ambassador Gallegos, it was because of the meeting that the two of them had that Congressman Engel went to Ecuador in the first place, because of his kind invitation to travel down to Ecuador. Let me start by giving you a brief readout of Congressman Engel's trip to Ecuador in February, which I joined him for. And then maybe at the end I can talk a bit about the March 1st Andean border crisis, since a great deal has happened since our trip down there. The trip was around February 18th or so, and then about 12 days later the Andean border crisis emerged. So there's a lot that's happened since then. Congressman Engel traveled to Ecuador, Bolivia, and Argentina in February. And he chose these three countries because they're all countries that, to some degree or another, have had tension in their relations with the United States over the past couple of years. Particularly in the case of Ecuador, my boss feels that there's a lot more that unites our two countries than divides us. And as he said in his meetings with the presidents of each of the three countries, from his perspective, he feels it's important for members of Congress to travel and let foreign leaders know that in the U.S., Congress is a co-equal branch that also has an important foreign policy role. In terms of Ecuador, just wanted to talk a bit about his meeting with President Correa. Congressman Engel came away from this meeting convinced that President Correa is someone with whom the U.S. can and should work closely, in spite of what we often hear up here. Correa, as my boss constantly says, he was educated in the United States, and in our meeting with him, it really came through that he has a great deal of fondness for our country, and really wants to find opportunities also to work together, even when there are disagreements between our countries. One such disagreement which came up in the course of our meetings down there, of course, and one which many of you know about, is the renewal of the agreement for the U.S.-run Manta base in Ecuador. As you might know, it's the forward operating location, or Manta base, in northern Ecuador. And the Manta base and our joint counter-narcotics efforts in Ecuador have really been a success story over the years. And my boss and many of his colleagues would definitely like to see the base continue operating. But that said, he also respects Ecuador's sovereignty and President Correa's wishes to have the U.S. leave after the lease agreement expires. And he really wants to work with the president, and they discuss this, to find additional ways to cooperate on counter-narcotics, even without the Manta base. The Manta base, obviously, as many of you might know, it's not actually a U.S. base, but it's a forward operating location there. And so there's a U.S. presence there. And as we understand, it still will continue some of the counter-narcotics work. Let me talk a bit about the Andean Trade Preference and Drug Eradication Act, or ATPDA, which the ambassador touched on, because that was one of the main focuses on our trip. My boss is one of the leading advocates for a long-term renewal of ATPDA for all four Andean countries. So that's Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. And in the case of Peru, it soon will not need the preferences when their free trade agreement is fully implemented at the end of this year. From the perspective of my boss, short-term extensions are a good start. But he feels that a short-term extension of the Andean trade preferences just does not promote the kind of stable investment climate that businesses need for long-term economic growth and job creation in the Andean region. ATPDA, as many of you know, has been a real success story. It's created hundreds of thousands of jobs in the Andean region, and at the same time, it fulfills a lot of U.S. geopolitical goals. In Ecuador, our delegation visited with producers of flowers, broccoli, coffee, cacao, and other products. Without the extension of ATPDA, it was made quite clear to us that these jobs, which are in sectors that don't directly compete with U.S. jobs, would quite simply be eliminated. And the argument has always gone that some workers will lose their jobs and then turn to the illegal drug trade, and this is definitely true, and the ambassador talked about the zero coca policy in Ecuador. While there's no doubt that this is true on the drug front, one of the things that Congressman Engel and the delegation learned is in their visit to Ecuador is that a failure to extend the Andean trade preferences would also likely cause many of these workers to illegally immigrate to the United States. And I just wanted to read an excerpt from a letter that Congressman Engel wrote to the New York Times following his visit to Ecuador. He wrote that, quote, "Those who worry about illegal immigration should embrace the Andean trade preferences, which help keep the citizens of the Andean region in sustainable jobs in their home countries," end quote. The week after our trip, Congress extended the Andean trade preferences for 10 months, and that takes us here to the end of December. So, Mr. Engel personally had hoped for a longer-term extension, but was happy to get 10 months for the 4 Andean countries, which was a little bit longer than the previous extension of 8 months. So this seems like we're on the right path, but again, in the past, the extensions have been 5 years, 2 years. So relatively speaking, these are short-term extensions. And in terms of thinking about a long-term investment climate, thinking about the stability of jobs in the Andean region, long-term extensions are more helpful in that front. Final thing on the trip, we met with U.S. aid beneficiaries, Peace Corps volunteers, projects with the Inter-American Foundation. And in all 3 instances, Congressman Engel and all the members of the delegation were really impressed by the good work being done on a day-to-day basis by the United States and Ecuador, something that we probably don't think about or know about these individual projects in a small country, but that really make a huge impact. I mentioned at the beginning that our delegation left Ecuador on February 18th, which was 12 days before the Andean border conflict between Ecuador and Colombia, which took place on March 1st. In terms of the crisis itself, Mr. Engel held a hearing on this matter, and he really believes that there are equities on both sides, and that neither side is completely right and neither side is completely wrong. And he was impressed by the excellent job that the Secretary General of the OAS, the Organization of American States, Jose Miguel Insulza, and the OAS member states did in working to resolve the crisis, as well as what President Leonel Fernandez from the Dominican Republic did in a meeting of the Rio Group in the Dominican Republic. But I do want to point out one of his frustrations regarding the U.S. reaction to the border crisis, and this is nothing new, it's something that he's expressed in public hearings. As you know, shortly after the tensions began to flare up between Colombia and Ecuador, President Bush reached out to Colombian President Alvaro Uribe, which Congressman Engel feels is perfectly appropriate. And let me say that he's visited Colombia twice. He thinks that President Uribe has done an incredibly impressive job in Colombia in really turning things around and reducing homicides, kidnappings, massacres, really bringing down these key indicators. From his perspective, however, he was disappointed that President Bush failed to reach out directly and personally to Ecuadorian President Correa. What most concerns him is that this could, in some ways, and maybe it has, it really remains to be seen, but cause some sort of degradation in relations between Ecuador and the United States as a result of the border crisis. And like I said, he feels that both Ecuador and Colombia are key U.S. allies, extremely important. But specifically in the Ecuador instance, he feels that we should have done more to reach out on that front. I just wanted to read a quote from the hearing that we held on this that sort of expressed his views regarding President Correa and this situation, and some of what I touched on at the beginning, and also the border crisis. Congressman Engel said that, he said, I met for over an hour, probably about an hour and a half with President Correa. I was impressed with President Correa. I know there have been some differences of opinion between some of the administration with Correa, but I personally think that we make a big mistake if we push him off and push him away and assume he is in cahoots with Chavez. I think we make a very, very big mistake. He's American educated. I know that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but I think what it means is that he's aware of our country and aware of our culture and what we stand for. He conveyed to me and the other members of my congressional delegation that he wanted to have good relations with the United States and he wanted to work with us. So I think that's really how he feels. He feels that there's a lot that can be gained between a positive relationship between Ecuador and the United States. And that was really a sentiment that was shared by all the members of his congressional delegation. It was a bipartisan delegation. And that's sort of how he's feeling moving ahead. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, very much.